The question is that this bill now be read a second time. I call the member for Denison.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, tertiary education matters, and I don't believe it's clear to the current government that tertiary education matters. It matters for many reasons. Perhaps first and foremost because of the inherent value of education, the inherent value of learning about things, about increasing our wisdom. It makes for a better world, a better community, a better country. There is an inherent value in the pursuit of learning, and we should fund that properly. It's also crucial that we keep up with other countries in the world and in our region, in particular with our trading partners. You know, if we want to compete in the future economy, in the current economy and the future economy, then we need to be smarter than our competitors. We need to do better research than our competitors. That will be the underpinning of a successful Australian economy in the global marketplace in the future. And it's not just so that we can compete with other countries, it's so that we can be an attractive destination for students from other countries. The fact is that education has already become a major industry in Australia, that a great many students from other countries choose to come to Australia's very, very fine universities, including the very fine university in my own electorate, the University of Tasmania. But if we don't invest in our universities, we run the real risk of being left behind, because in the global education marketplace, Deputy Speaker, students from any country, from just about any country, can choose to study in just about any country. So although our universities have made a very fine start and are at the moment global leaders in supplying education to foreign fee-paying students, we run the real risk of being left behind if we don't continue to fund our universities properly. Not just avoiding cuts to investment in our universities, but to be finding the money to spend even more in our universities. Because as good as our universities are currently, they can be so much better, and they will have to be so much better if they are to be seen by foreign fee-paying students as institutions of excellence, institutions that they will choose to travel from their country to come to study. There's also the inherent value of education for the students and what it brings for students. It's not just a case of learning new skills and becoming qualified, to be a doctor or an architect or an engineer or a teacher or a nurse or anything else. There's also the very important social value of education. Education is the great leveller, particularly for students or people from disadvantaged backgrounds, people who are looking for that way to get a leg up, to be able to better themselves, to get a decent job, perhaps be the first person in their family for a generation or two to have a job, have a good job. And with education and with a job and with new skills comes a better standard of living, comes better health outcomes. I think this is something, Deputy Speaker, that we don't focus on enough, the importance of education in this country as a leveller, and something that helps particularly disadvantaged students to get ahead and to have a good future for themselves and for their family. Of course, tertiary education is also a very important economic driver locally. I think of my home state of Tasmania, where the University of Tasmania, a very fine university, is one of the biggest employers in the state. It's also a barometer. When our university prospers, it seems that our economy does well. When our university is under pressure, our economy seems to be not doing very, very well. And in fact, right now, the University of Tasmania faces the very real prospect of cutting something like 150 staff. Now, that's a lot of people in a state of 500,000 people, of only 500,000 people. So, Deputy Speaker, there are lots of reasons why tertiary education matters, why our universities matter, why we must not just not cut their funding, we must find extra money to make sure that they can be everything that they can be. Deputy Speaker, we live in one of the richest, most clever, most fortunate countries in the world. There's no reason why we can't have the very best universities in the world, not just now but into the future. As the member for Melbourne quite rightly said, it's all about priorities. But despite all this, despite the fact that we have good unis with a bright future everything else being equal. Regrettably, though, it's under attack. It's under very, very serious attack. In the last 2 years alone, the cuts to the tertiary sector in Australia are over $4 billion. Over $4,000 million cut from the tertiary education sector in Australia over just the last 2 years. In other words, Australian universities, despite their importance, despite all the promise, despite all the reasons why we should be investing in them, despite all of that, the fact is that Australian universities are currently underfunded by some $1 billion a year. And I make the point again. The knock-on effect at the local level in my hometown of Hobart is that the University of Tasmania is looking to shed 150 jobs at a time when the economy is soft, at a time when government should be investing in all of the institutions of the community, including the university, and not just making for richer and better communities, but also employing people. This bill is another attack on the tertiary sector. This bill, if it becomes law, will result in a cut of more than $900 million from the tertiary sector over the next 4 years, in the form of so-called efficiency dividends. I mean, what sort of political gobbledygook is an efficiency dividend? Why don't we call it for what it is? It's a cut to your budget. Suck it up and live with it. That's what it is. And when you've got institutions like universities, one of the few ways, or some of the few ways they can save money, they can cut courses, they can cut staff, they can cut facilities, they can cut campuses, which is a real issue for some of the universities that have very small satellite campuses, like the University of Tasmania does, with a relatively small campus in Burnie, another one in Launceston. So why don't we cut all the political gobbledygook about an efficiency dividend? The fact is that if this bill becomes law, $900 million will be gutted from the Australian tertiary sector over the next 4 years. That will cut, just at the University of Tasmania, something like $30 million over the next 4 years. Yes, this bill, just this bill, if it becomes law, will cut something like $30 million out of the University of Tasmania over the next 4 years. That will hurt the university. The university will have to consider cutting courses, cutting staff. It will hurt the university. It will hurt students, because ultimately, as a university has less resources, that's less resources that are for the benefit of the students in one way or another. And it will hurt the Tasmanian economy. You know, the Tasmanian unemployment rate at the moment is way over 8%, the highest of any state in the land. You know, we can't afford this sort of cut to federal investment, particularly at a time like this when the economy is under so much pressure. Crucially, the bill would also reduce the discount for the early payment of HECS and HELP, which will save the government something like $300 million over 4 years. Now again, Deputy Speaker, that's political gobbledygook, saying it's going to save the government $300 million. What we should be saying instead, Deputy Speaker, is it's going to cost the tertiary sector, in one way or another, $300 million over 4 years. That's what it is. We shouldn't be talking about savings measures for the government. We shouldn't be talking about how much the government will save. That's a consequence. In the first instance, what it means is a cut to the tertiary sector. And yeah, sure, there are all sorts of people who can afford to pay their HECS or their HELP debt off early. Sure, there are some students from very advantaged backgrounds where maybe mum and dad can afford to pay their HECS. But I tell you what, there's also a lot of students from disadvantaged backgrounds who are busting their boiler after hours to scrape together the money to try and pay off their debt. Just as there are some very disadvantaged families who are busting their boiler, mum and dad both working 2 jobs to try and pay off that debt so that their son or daughter doesn't have that debt into their working life. Let's not kid ourselves. Getting rid of the discount for early payment of HECS and HELP, yes, it will be of little consequence for some students and their families, but it will be a very big consequence, Deputy Speaker, for other students and for their families. Of course, we shouldn't just look at this bill in isolation, because we've got another bill coming down the driveway, the Social Services and Other Legislation Amendment Bill. And I think when we're discussing the bill before us today, we should also be cross-referencing it with the other bill that we may well be debating and deciding this week in this place. Because the Social Services and Other Legislation Amendment Bill will be another savage cut to the tertiary sector, and in particular, and most worrying, a savage cut to students who can afford it the least, because that bill will abolish the start-up scholarships and impose HECS or help-type fees or loans on students. Now, let's put this in perspective. The only students who are getting those start-up scholarships were the most disadvantaged students in the land, the people who could barely afford to get to university, and for many of whom the scholarship was the very difference between getting to uni or not. But yet this government sees fit to get rid of those scholarships. This government sees fit to slap onto some of the most disadvantaged students in Australia a debt that they will have to carry into their working life, a debt that at the end of the day could be some $10,000. I mean, can I come back to the point, one of the first points I made, Deputy Speaker, about education as the great leveller. Education is what helps so many young people, particularly young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, to get ahead, to catch up, to get a decent job, get a decent income, buy a house, bring up a family, provide for their children the sort of things that those children deserve. It's the great leveller. But yet, completely at odds with the idea of it being a great leveller, this government sees fit to get rid of start-up scholarships and to slap a dirty big debt on some of these most disadvantaged students in the land. And talking of students, Deputy Speaker, let's just talk a little bit more broadly for a moment. It's pretty tough out there. You can't live on youth allowance. The average Australian university undergraduate works something like 20 hours a week. How on earth can you study and achieve to your very, very best when you're working half a job? You can't. So the student gets a less than perfect outcome, which means our community gets a less than perfect outcome. And now we're going to axe the start-up scholarships. And all of this, Deputy Speaker, in one of the richest, most clever, most fortunate countries in the world. I again echo the member for Melbourne and the very good point he made. It's all about priorities. You know, the income for the government in this financial year is forecast to be about $380,000 million. Surely that's enough, with the right priorities, to have the world's best universities, the world's best resourced teachers in those universities, the world's best resourced researchers in those universities, a fair deal, a fair go for the students who attend those universities. And while we're at it, surely $380,000 million a year, not only to have the best universities in the world, have the best colleges in the world, the best high schools in the world, the best primary schools in the world, the best early childhood education in the world, including a fair wage for a fair day's work for the early childhood educators that populate those centres. It's all about priorities. And I do lament the fact, Deputy Speaker, that this government, when it comes to tertiary education, has its priorities all out of whack. The previous government did too, but I will acknowledge and applaud the Labor Party for deciding to oppose this bill. That is the right thing to do. So I'm pleased to stand next to, but not part of, the Labor Party and the Greens in opposing this bill, just as I will also oppose the associated Social Services and Other Legislation Amendment Bill, if only because of the way it attacks our universities. Thanks, Deputy Speaker.